Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Saturday conversation. I'm delighted this morning to have Peter Dowling here, with whom we've been having some conversations recently, and Peter has joined our Thought for the Day team, so you might recognise him from some of his wonderful thoughts that he's given. So it's delightful to have you with us, Peter. Thank you for joining us today. And we thought we might start. Good. Just start thinking about, obviously birth is quite a good place to start, but sort of birth and birth of faith as well, and how that came about.
Yes, I thought your partners this week saying the Christian faith is all about journeying was actually a sort of handwritten entree to perhaps to this conversation. It's great. You said you were interested in my passageway through the Christian faith, and so if we start with birth and faith, life has been in that regard very easy for me. I love my father, and he introduced me as a Christian to being one, and I, loving him, just accepted it without thought. And I reflect later that maybe as life goes on, maybe that was too easy. It was just an acceptance of what my father told me. I was a war baby and born in 42, but he had been at Cambridge reading geography, and he lied about his age and went into the Navy for the war. And then he went back to Cambridge after the war, which must have been desperately hard. Got his degree and then went on to teach at a school that he'd been to in his sort of time before he went to university. And he became headmaster after 6 months. The school was Bickley Hall. It was a prep school, private school in Kent. And the headmaster had died very suddenly. So I was thrown into the school, my home, at 5.5 or 6 years old as a boarder, which wasn't easy. And that was really where I suppose faith started to coagulate, because the school was run very much on Christian lines. It wasn't declared as a Christian school particularly, but it was. Father was a lay reader by that time. And I just loved prep school, even if it was in my own home. And chapel took on an important part, and we all had to read lessons if we felt up to it, but not without being taught how to read lessons. And that's something which has taken me right through my life.
Yeah, that's certainly a skill that stayed with you.
Well, it became easy or easier after a time, but one was always a little bit fearful on Saturday evening of going into the chapel and having to read the lesson and expecting to see whether Father, headmaster, smiled or didn't.
Yes.
I also enjoyed prep school for other reasons. Dancing class was one of the reasons. There was no faith attached to dancing class, but girls were attached to dancing class.
Yes. Yeah.
And in particular, the girl who became my wife.
Yeah.
But we'll go back to that. So the faith was something which I never questioned. I was a Christian. I sang in the choir, I worshipped. Michael Scott Joint, late Bishop of Winchester, sang in the choir. He was the choir leader of the choir. And I went on to rugby, which I loved again. And I think my faith grew there because it was harder, in a way, to be an active Christian at public school, because there were 800 of us for a start. And while the chapel was a daily event, the small chapel where we had Sunday services was much more an attendance thing if you fancied it.
Yeah.
And I did. So I started to grow in faith.
You'd have good chaplains there as well, were the people who could sort of teach and explain faith as you were growing?
Yes. I mean, I can't tell you what they explained to me at this distance of time, but it wasn't anti, certainly.
Yeah.
And I left school, and before I went into training to be a chartered accountant in the city, I went out to Austria for 3 months in the summer. I'd never been abroad ever. And I went on the train from London to Innsbruck, And I can remember not sleeping in a very
Yes.
hard wooden seat on the carriage, but then waking up finally and looking out of the window and saw mountains. Never seen a mountain, and a snow-covered mountain. That was the nearest thing to a miracle that I could ever see. Just wonderful.
Yeah.
And I worked in Austria with a group of Mennonites. They were Americans. They were anti-war, and the only way they could avoid the draft in America was to do service in public service. Very interesting time. Most of the children who were in the home that I was working at, which was started with prayers, ended with prayers, were products of the war, I think, and a lot of them were of mixed parentage because of the occupation, etc., etc. So that was an interesting time. And then I came back and started training in the city. And everywhere I've been, there seems to have been a church involved. Either it sought me out, or more likely I sought it out initially. Yeah. And for me in the city, St. Michael's Cornhill was a very important church. I used to go there midweek if I was working in that part of the city where they had midweek communions. Sal, by that time, was singing in the choir at St. Michael's under Harold Dark, who wrote In the Bleak Midwinter, and who I think must be some distant relationship to our Darks here in Hyde, but they're a bit reticent in digging it out.
Interesting.
No, not for any reason other than they can't sort of see a natural connection. Yeah. And the vicar, the rector there, was a chap called Norman Motley, who started a community in Essex called the Athona community. And I used to go down there for weekends, and that was very much a faith-led thing. So gradually, I suppose, I was growing, but churches were there. I didn't have a crisis and say no. We were married in St. Michael's, the children were christened there, and it's again had a continuing part in our life. And so it was when we lived in Abbotsford and then in Broughton, and even when I had to go and work in America, because I was reconfirmed by the Bishop of Philadelphia. It was Episcopal, and my church was St. Peter's in the Great Valley, which they were intensely, it was built like an old church, but it was a fairly old church because they were very pleased that it was 200 years old while I was there. But they used to love to listen to an English voice reading to them from time to time. And they got very excited when they had their 200th anniversary, but I felt minded to remind them that I was in Winchester Diocese at home and we had just celebrated our 700th.
Yes. That's right.
I don't think they were very pleased.
No. But and then eventually, at some point, you ended after a very interesting working life all over the place. You ended up in Hyde, you and Sally, and you've been there for quite a long time, haven't you?
Yes, we came here in 2008. And actually, when we saw Abbotswell, the first place we went to, having looked over it, was the church, because our move here was defensive, because where we were before, where they were threatening in Wiltshire to build 10,000 houses in Wiltshire over the next 5 years. And we thought, don't think we can stay with that. So let's retreat into a fastness of national park where we might be safer.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got lots of common ground here. My grandfather and grandmother are buried in the church just over the hill. It's a village called. You've got a church there.
Yeah, over the hill. I mean, we've got Godsfield, Hale, Wood Green.
Hale, yeah.
Hale.
Wood Green. They're in Wood Green churchyard, and my grandfather lived up at near the Fighting Cocks in a cottage there when I was young, growing up. So we were sort of coming round full circle, really.
Yes.
I like Hyde Church and the community very much, I must say. But I do think perhaps because my faith was always there, not perhaps as active as it should have been, because it was just an acceptance in my life.
Yes.
And I'm starting to read Pete Gregg and other people, and I find that perhaps I've been too complacent. Perhaps I need to challenge myself in relation to my faith and try and deepen it. And I think I do now, after what's happened, have a chance to do that.
And what the really significant thing about what's happened is when Sally became ill, well, which must be probably getting on for 4 years ago now, isn't it?
Yes, it was in 2018. Yeah, just 4 years ago now. It was in 2018 that she was diagnosed, and that really was really an absolute showstopper, because you go through life and suddenly they tell you that something is inoperable, and you immediately think, gosh, we better design the funeral, which we did.
Yeah.
And then put it in a cardboard box. And I couldn't find it when we really needed to have quite a search to dig it out, because we'd been together for such a long time, and the diagnosis was like a brick wall, really. I couldn't see my way through it. But we were so lucky. In reflection, I can tell you, we were so lucky. My father died very suddenly. He was drying up the dishes after supper and talking to my mother, and he said, "I want you to," and he never finished the sentence. He just dropped dead. We had 3 years. 3 years we didn't expect that we were going to get. And that allowed us all sorts of exploration and reflection, and going back over times past and times with the family. And yeah, it was really a blessing. I can't tell you it in any ways, but it was.
Yeah. And Sally was able to be wonderfully cared for at home, wasn't she, right to the end?
She was. I mean, that was a conscious decision that we made to try and do it. Lockdown helped, I suppose, because it was more difficult to even think. But we had to. Nick, our younger, he was the chap who kept his eye on risk assessment as to what we could and couldn't do, because in circumstances where someone is like that, getting worse very, very slowly, you're always taking a step backwards, because last week you could do this, but this week it's unsafe to do it. And so we moved back, but she didn't have a night away from the house, which was
amazing.
Really wonderful. And we've got a wooden floor in our living room. It's a big living room. And so her special bed that she had was on wheels, and we could push her down to the fire or to watch the television. And Nick built a ramp so that we could get her through the French windows into the garden. And yes, it was all good stuff, really.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I mean, that must have been a really difficult time. And then eventually Sally died.
Yes.
And of course, that's been a very, very difficult and challenging time since then, has it? They had a wonderful funeral, which was well planned.
Well, it was
a spectacular event.
I mean, she had sung in Winchester for 32 years with the Wainfleet Singers when we lived in Broughton. That was really our home focus in terms of singing. And singing was always very important for her, even when she was at school. I mean, she was a great singer. So we knew we had to try and get a link back to Winchester, and the Wainfleet Singers and David Hill, who you know well, all agreed to come. In fact, they were saying, "How many can you take?" And we had to draw the line, because we were very much locked down in those days.
Yes.
But it was a wonderful service, which you played a great part in. And we said a final prayer in that service, the family. We stood up and committed her to God's continuing care. We returned her to his tender, loving care, in the sure and certain knowledge that until we meet again, he would keep her as the apple of his eye. And I believe. Yeah. I have absolute trust and faith that we will meet again. But it was a difficult time.
Yeah.
I've grown through it, and I'm sure that my faith has helped enormously. There are endless books and things one can read about getting to grips with grief, and all of them well written and well meaning, but a lot of them are secular, and they don't mention faith as an integral part of the process. And I think it must be.
Yes.
Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree, yeah. And I mean, things have gone on. Life doesn't always get easier, but you mentioned the journey of faith at the beginning, and that journey is still continuing, isn't it? Now in a sort of new, slightly new phase in a way.
It is, because you think to yourself, well, yes, I've got terrible sadness, but I will work my way through that, and then I'm on my way. But I think your body, and particularly your brain, has other ideas. And my brain is working hard to try and get its head around the fact that here is an entirely new direction. And all the synapses and connections that it always had have now got to be unconnected, well, and reconnected, but in a different way. And it hasn't got itself sorted out yet, I've concluded. I keep making lists of lists in case I forget. You know, you are on 2 lists over the last 24 hours, just in case I forgot.
Yeah.
And I get confused from time to time, and I'm finding it hard to read. I used to read a lot, but I don't seem to be able to read at the moment. Now, that'll all work out, I'm sure. And I do feel that my faith, hopefully, will take me in a direction where I can take some positive steps in some support mechanism. And I immediately think that my experiences with the hospice and the church, etc., during Sal's illness would ideally suit me to that. The chaplaincy team at the hospital say that it might, but they don't want to see me for 2 years, thank you very much, just in case. And they're right.
That's quite wise.
When I sit back and reflect, they're right. Because in those circumstances, even in some pastoral care circumstances, one can and will be faced with situations which could very easily trigger, without my willing it, some reaction which would be just what the person I'm talking to doesn't need to hear.
Yes.
So I suppose I have time for reflection. I'm making myself have time for reflection.
Thank you. And I think you've got a prayer which you want to finish with, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Let me just get it up so that I can read it to you. Thank you for listening to me and letting me talk with you. I think that's very helpful. Dear Father, here I am. In this day and all that it holds, I give myself to you. Renew in me this day the wonder of your love. And give me quietness that I may hear you speaking to me today. Amen.
Amen. That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Peter. Not always an easy conversation, but you've been so sort of honest and with the journey of faith. It's been really a privilege just to share these 2 minutes with you. And I hope all those people who are going to be listening as well will be able to think about it, ponder it, and learn from your journey of faith, so that they're on their journey of faith as well. So just to say, and as most people will know, we're here every day at 10 o'clock, worship tomorrow, and then talk for the day and morning prayer during the week. And the people are always welcome to that. If you are hearing this on this morning, Saturday morning, rush down to the church hall in Fordingbridge, where the big train exhibition is on for today till 10 till 4 and Sunday 10 till 4 as well. It's just amazing, very meditative, seeing all these trains going round and round on the track. What wonderful event. And once again, thank you very much, Peter, for joining us this morning. Thank you. Bye all. Bye.